Have you ever believed in promises that felt too beautiful to question? Plans for the future, dreams shared late at night, words that made everything feel possible. They spoke about tomorrow as if it already belonged to both of you. Trips you would take, goals you would reach, a life that sounded stable, secure, hopeful. And when they spoke, you believed them, not blindly, hopefully, because hope feels natural when someone paints a future that includes you. At first, those promises feel comforting, reassuring, exciting. They make uncertainty feel smaller. They make the future feel safer. You begin imagining moments that have not yet happened, places you will go, things you will build, experiences you will share. And imagination creates connection, not real connection, future connection, the kind built on possibility rather than reality. You begin trusting their words as if they were plans, not ideas, not wishes, plans. You begin making space in your life for what they described, adjusting your expectations, reshaping your priorities, not dramatically, gradually, because promises create direction. Direction creates movement, and movement creates belief. But over time, something begins shifting, not in the promises, in the results. The future they described never fully arrives. Plans remain ideas, dreams remain words, promises remain promises. You begin noticing delays, excuses, postponed plans, not once, repeatedly. Each time, there is explanation, reason, justification, something that sounds logical, believable, temporary. You tell yourself that circumstances change, that life creates obstacles, that timing matters, and those explanations feel reasonable because trust feels stronger than doubt. Another quiet shift begins forming when promises become more frequent than actions. They talk about what will happen, what they will do, what they will change. But action feels delayed, postponed, moved further into the future, not completely abandoned, just delayed, always delayed. And delay creates confusion, not immediate confusion, gradual confusion, the kind that builds after repeated moments, where expectation meets absence. You begin remembering earlier promises, plans that felt important, conversations that felt meaningful, moments where certainty felt strong. And yet, when you look back, many of those promises remain unfinished, unrealized, unfulfilled. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when hope begins replacing evidence. Not because evidence does not exist, because hope feels stronger. You want to believe improvement will happen, change will happen, action will happen, because belief feels comforting, encouraging, necessary. You begin holding on to future possibilities, even when present reality feels uncertain. You remind yourself of their words, their intentions, their promises, because promises create reassurance, even when reassurance lacks action. Another important shift begins forming when emotional investment begins depending on what they promise rather than what they do. You feel connected, not to present behavior, but to future expectation, not to consistency, but to possibility. And possibility creates attachment, not stable attachment, hopeful attachment, the kind that depends on what might happen rather than what is happening. You begin noticing how often conversations return to the future, not the present, not current behavior, future plans, future change, future improvement, and future becomes comfort. Even when present remains uncertain, another subtle shift appears when disappointment begins feeling temporary instead of meaningful. Plans fail, promises fade, expectations collapse. But hope returns. You tell yourself that next time, things will be different. That delay was temporary. That intention still exists, because intention feels valuable even when action is absent. And repeated hope creates delay. Delay in recognition, delay in awareness, delay in understanding that promises alone cannot build reality. Another powerful realization begins forming when you recognize how easily words created belief. Not because you were naive, because words felt sincere, convincing, emotional. They spoke with confidence, with certainty, with emotion, and emotional certainty feels trustworthy. You believe not only the words, but the feeling behind them, the conviction, the passion, the excitement. And excitement creates trust, not logical trust, emotional trust, the kind that feels real, even when results remain distant. And this is where the first awareness begins forming, not about the promises, about the pattern. Understanding that repeated promises, without repeated action, create illusion, not progress, not commitment. Illusion. And once illusion begins fading, clarity begins forming. Not suddenly. Gradually, you begin asking questions that once felt unnecessary. Not what will happen next, but what has already happened. Not what they promised to do, but what they have actually done. And those questions begin revealing something deeper. Not about the future, about the present. Understanding that promises can create hope, but only actions create trust. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Not through one broken promise, through repetition. Repeated promises that sound convincing, but remain unfinished. At first, the delay feels temporary, understandable, explainable. Life happens, plans change, circumstances shift, and those explanations feel logical. You tell yourself that flexibility is necessary, that patience is maturity, that waiting is part of commitment, and waiting feels reasonable when belief remains strong. Another quiet shift begins forming when promises begin arriving faster than results. They talk about what will happen, what they will build, what they will change. They describe future actions with confidence, certainty, detail, and detail creates belief. You imagine specific moments, specific outcomes, specific improvements, not vague hopes, clear expectations. And expectations create emotional investment. You begin feeling connected to a future that has not yet happened, not to present reality, to possibility. And possibility becomes emotional anchor. You hold on to it, protect it, believe in it. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when action becomes postponed rather than completed. Plans are discussed, then delayed, then adjusted, then postponed again, not canceled, moved, always moved, further into the future. You begin hearing phrases that sound familiar. Soon, later, when things calm down, when the timing feels right. And those words create distance between promise and reality. Not visible distance, emotional distance, the kind that keeps hope alive while results remain absent. Another subtle shift appears when disappointment begins feeling temporary instead of significant. Plans fail. You feel frustration, confusion, disappointment. But reassurance arrives quickly. New promises appear. New plans are described. New visions are created. And those new promises replace the old disappointment. Not resolve it, replace it. And replacement creates distraction. You stop focusing on what failed. You begin focusing on what might happen next. and attention shifts from past results to future possibility. Another important pattern begins forming when responsibility begins shifting away from them and towards circumstances, not their decision, not their action. Circumstances, timing, external problems, unexpected obstacles, and external explanations feel easier to accept because blaming circumstances feels less confrontational than questioning behavior. You begin sympathizing, understanding, supporting. You offer patience instead of accountability because patience feels kind. Accountability feels uncomfortable, and repeated patience creates permission. Permission for delay, permission for inaction, permission for continued promises without completion. Another meaningful shift begins forming when promises begin sounding larger than before, not smaller, bigger, more detailed, more emotional, more convincing. You hear bigger plans, more impressive visions, more exciting possibilities, and bigger promises. Create stronger belief, not logical belief, emotional belief, the kind that feels powerful, even when evidence remains limited. You begin imagining greater outcomes, greater changes, greater improvement, because bigger promises create bigger hope, and hope becomes protective. Protective of belief, protective of trust, protective of the relationship itself. Another subtle pattern appears when time begins passing without measurable change, not days, weeks, months. You begin noticing how long promises remain unfinished, how long plans remain unstarted, how long intentions remain unfulfilled, and time becomes evidence, not spoken evidence, observed evidence. You begin comparing what was promised with what was delivered, and comparison creates awareness, not immediate awareness, gradual awareness, the kind that forms slowly as repetition becomes undeniable. Another powerful shift begins forming when your expectations begin adjusting to match delay. You expect less, wait longer, accept postponement as normal, not exceptional. And normalization creates tolerance, not healthy tolerance. Passive tolerance. Tolerance for repeated delay that once felt unacceptable. You begin lowering expectations, not because standards changed, because hope feels exhausting. And exhaustion creates surrender, not complete surrender, gradual surrender. Another important realization begins forming when you begin noticing that emotional reassurance replaces real progress. They speak kindly, reassuringly, confidently. They promise improvement, change, action, and reassurance feels comforting, temporarily. But reassurance without action creates illusion, not stability, not growth, illusion, the kind that feels real until results are measured. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when frustration begins competing with hope. You feel disappointment and belief at the same time, confusion and trust at the same time, doubt and hope at the same time. And emotional conflict creates hesitation, not clarity. You begin asking yourself difficult questions, not what will happen next, but why has nothing happened yet? Not what they promised, but what they delivered. And those questions create pressure, not emotional pressure, reality pressure, the kind that demands evidence, not explanation. Evidence. And once evidence becomes important, patterns become visible, not hidden, not explainable, visible. You begin recognizing that promises created movement without progress, motion without direction, words without results. And once that realization begins forming, the next stage becomes unavoidable. Recognition that repeated promises may not be hope, but control. Control through expectation, control through delay, control through future possibility that never fully arrives. And this is where the deeper recognition begins, not about the future, about the pattern. Understanding that promises without action create emotional attachment without stability. And once that truth becomes visible, the next shift begins forming. Recognition that belief must be built, not from promises, but from action. And this is where hope begins changing, from comfort into trap, not suddenly, gradually, quietly enough that you barely notice when belief turns into waiting, because hope feels beautiful, encouraging, protective. It keeps disappointment from feeling final. It keeps doubt from feeling permanent. You tell yourself that things will improve, that change will come, that promises will eventually become reality, and waiting feels temporary at first. You believe patience will create results, that loyalty will create stability, that time will prove commitment, and those beliefs feel strong, meaningful, worth protecting. But over time, waiting begins feeling heavier, not hopeful, exhausting. Another important shift begins forming when hope begins replacing evidence. You begin holding on to future possibility instead of present reality. You remember what they promised, what they described, what they assured you would happen. And those words begin carrying weight, greater than action. You begin defending promises, even when results remain missing. You remind yourself of their intentions, their goals, their dreams, because intention feels sincere, meaningful, comforting. But intention without action creates delay, not progress, delay. And delay stretches time, not visibly, emotionally. You begin noticing how long you've been waiting, not days, not weeks, months, sometimes longer. You begin realizing how many conversations ended with reassurance instead of results. How many moments felt hopeful without becoming real. And recognition creates discomfort, not dramatic discomfort, quiet discomfort, the kind that stays in the background of your thoughts. Another meaningful pattern begins forming when disappointment begins repeating without resolution. Plans fail. You feel frustration. You feel doubt. You feel confusion. But before frustration settles, new promises appear, new timelines, new expectations, new visions. And those new promises replace disappointment, not resolve it. Replace it. And replacement creates distraction. You stop examining failure. You begin focusing on possibility. And possibility becomes emotional relief, temporary relief, not permanent clarity. Another powerful shift begins forming when you begin measuring commitment through words instead of behavior. They speak passionately, confidently, emotionally, and emotion creates belief. You feel their conviction, their excitement, their certainty, and certainty feels trustworthy. Even when action feels uncertain, you begin trusting tone more than results, feeling more than reality, and emotional conviction creates attachment, not secure attachment, hopeful attachment, the kind built on possibility rather than consistency. Another subtle shift appears when leaving begins feeling harder than staying, not because staying feels comfortable, because leaving feels uncertain. You fear losing potential, missing future improvement, abandoning possibility before it becomes real. And fear of losing possibility creates hesitation, not clarity. You begin telling yourself, just a little more time, just one more chance. just one more promise. And repeated chances create repetition, not improvement. Repetition. Another important realization begins forming when you notice how often hope delays decisions. You delay confrontation, delay boundaries, delay difficult conversations. Not because they are impossible, because hope suggests that change will happen soon. You wait instead of acting. Trust instead of questioning. Believe instead of observing. And waiting becomes habit, not temporary habit, repeated habit. Another meaningful shift begins appearing when exhaustion begins replacing excitement. What once felt inspiring now feels draining. What once felt hopeful now feels uncertain. What once felt promising now feels unfinished. You begin noticing emotional fatigue, not from effort, from waiting. Waiting requires patience. Patience requires energy. And repeated waiting creates depletion. Not visible depletion, emotional depletion. The kind that reduces confidence, reduces clarity, reduces certainty. Another powerful realization begins forming when you recognize how hope creates attachment to future possibility instead of present truth. You remain connected to what might happen, not to what is happening. You remain invested in potential, not consistency. And potential feels comforting, even when reality feels unstable. Another subtle shift appears when doubt begins competing with belief. You feel uncertainty while holding on to hope. You feel hesitation while trusting promises. You feel confusion while waiting for results. And emotional conflict creates pressure, not external pressure, internal pressure, the kind that keeps you suspended between belief and reality. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you begin noticing patterns that once felt invisible. Repeated promises, repeated delays, repeated explanations, repeated waiting. And repetition creates clarity, not sudden clarity, gradual clarity, the kind that forms after time reveals patterns. And once patterns become visible, hope begins changing, not disappearing, shifting. From blind belief to careful observation, from expectation to awareness. And awareness becomes powerful, not aggressive, not defensive, protective. You begin asking new questions, not what will they promise next, but what have they actually done? Not what future they describe, but what present they create. And those questions create distance, not emotional distance, reality distance, the kind that separates words from action. And once that separation becomes clear, hope loses its illusion, not entirely, gradually. And this is where the final shift begins forming. Not rejection, not confrontation, recognition. Recognition that promises cannot replace behavior. Recognition that belief must be built on evidence. Recognition that hope must be supported by action. And once that recognition becomes clear, the final stage begins. Not ending, awakening. And this is where the most important shift begins, not in their promises, in your perception of them. Because once patterns become visible, words begin losing their illusion. Not all words, repeated words, without repeated action. You begin noticing the difference between intention and behavior, between excitement and effort, between promises and results. And that difference becomes clearer with time, not because promises disappear, because observation increases. You begin paying attention, not to what is said, but to what is done. You begin observing consistency, follow-through, completion, not emotional conviction, not confident speech, action, real movement, visible progress. And once action becomes the measure, illusion begins fading. Another important shift begins forming when you stop measuring commitment through future plans. Not every promise proves loyalty. Not every vision proves dedication. Not every future proves intention. You begin recognizing that commitment lives in the present, not in tomorrow, not in someday, not in imagined outcomes, in daily behavior, in repeated effort, in consistent action. And consistency creates trust, not promises, not ideas. Consistency. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you understand that hope should never replace evidence. Hope can inspire, encourage, motivate. But hope without evidence creates illusion, not stability, not security. Illusion, the kind that feels real until time reveals truth. And truth rarely appears through promises. It appears through patterns, repeated actions, repeated delays, repeated follow-through, or repeated absence of it. Another powerful shift begins forming when you allow yourself to acknowledge disappointment, not hide it, not minimize it, acknowledge it. You allow yourself to recognize that promises were not fulfilled, that plans were not completed, that expectations were not met. Not to blame, to understand, because understanding requires honesty, not explanation. Honesty, another meaningful change begins appearing when you stop protecting promises and begin protecting yourself. Not emotionally withdrawing, emotionally observing. You begin asking yourself, what has actually happened? What has truly changed? What has consistently improved? And those questions create clarity, not immediate clarity, gradual clarity, the kind that builds as observation replaces belief. Another important realization begins forming when you recognize that trust should grow from reliability, not imagination, not possibility, reliability. You begin noticing who completes what they promise, who follows through, who acts without needing reminders. And reliability creates confidence, not hope. Confidence, the kind that feels stable instead of uncertain. Another powerful shift begins forming when you stop attaching your emotions to promises of the future. Instead, you begin grounding your expectations in present behavior, not imagined outcomes, real outcomes. You begin noticing what exists instead of what might exist, and reality becomes clearer, not more comfortable, more honest. Another subtle shift appears when you stop accepting delay as proof of effort. Delay is not progress. Words are not completion. Plans are not results. You begin measuring time against action, not against explanation. And time reveals truth, not instantly, gradually. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you understand that promises alone cannot sustain connection. Connection requires effort, consistency, accountability, not possibility, not imagination, real participation, real responsibility. And responsibility becomes visible through action, not description. Another powerful shift appears when you begin trusting your perception again, not blindly, carefully, respectfully. You notice when promises feel repetitive, when timelines shift repeatedly, when action feels delayed again and again, and recognition becomes protective, not fearful. Protective. You begin protecting your time, your expectations, your emotional investment, not selfishly, wisely. Another meaningful change begins forming when you stop waiting for the future to prove the present. You begin evaluating the present as it exists now, not as it might exist later. You begin asking, if nothing changed, would I still accept this? If promises stopped, would behavior remain meaningful? And those questions create strength. Not loud strength, grounded strength, the kind that protects reality from illusion. Another important realization begins forming when you understand that future faking survives only when promises remain unquestioned, when belief replaces observation, when hope replaces evidence. But once observation begins, patterns become visible, not hidden, not confusing, visible. You begin recognizing that promises were never the problem. Repetition was, delay was, absence of action was. And once repetition becomes clear, decisions become easier, not painless. Clearer, you begin trusting patterns instead of promises, behavior instead of description, reality instead of imagination. And reality creates stability, not illusion. Stability. Another powerful shift begins forming when you recognize that your time deserves reliability, not endless waiting, not endless reassurance. Reliability, completion, follow-through. And once reliability becomes expectation, tolerance for illusion decreases. Not because you became cold, because you became aware. And awareness changes everything. You begin choosing relationships that feel grounded, consistent, reliable, not emotionally dramatic, not endlessly promising, quietly dependable. Another meaningful realization begins forming when you stop asking, what will happen next? And begin asking, what has already happened? Because past behavior reveals future behavior, not promises, patterns, and patterns create prediction, not hope, understanding. So if any part of this felt familiar, if promises once created belief that later created disappointment, do not ignore that recognition, because awareness protects clarity, protects time, protects emotional investment, and once awareness becomes habit, future faking loses its influence, not because promises disappear, because illusion disappears. You begin trusting action more than words, consistency more than emotion, reality more than imagination. And when action becomes stronger than promises, when evidence becomes stronger than hope, when clarity becomes stronger than illusion, future faking loses its power. Because promises alone cannot build reality, only action can. And once that truth becomes clear, you begin choosing differently, believing differently, trusting differently. Not because trust disappeared, because trust became wiser, stronger, grounded in reality.